Hi, I'm Chip Rogers, and welcome to the AAHOA Educational Experience. This week, we're talking about the world of franchising, and joining me today are three experts in franchising, one of them an attorney that works in this field. We'll start with Robert Zarko of the law firm Zarko, Einhorn, Salkowski, and Brito. Next to him is Ron Gardner, who is managing partner at Dady & Gardner. And finally, Carmen Caruso, who is with Caruso Kaplan. And gentlemen, I'd like to start first with a discussion that would lend itself to those who are interested in starting a new franchise, or perhaps they have a franchise and want to begin another franchise. What are perhaps the most important things you need to know right out of the gate? What is something, the information you've got to have before you decide to start with a franchise? Robert?
Chip, one of the most important things that a prospective franchisee should consider is what are their likes and dislikes in life. For instance, if you are someone who has a background in the cosmetology business, to all of a sudden say you're going to pursue an auto transmission business may be something that may not necessarily fit within your experience and your background. The reality, though, is that you're not always limited, because frankly, when franchise systems are in place and they have had the ability to, prepare a system in a way that the mousetrap has already been invented, the reality is that some people can pursue areas of interest that are different than what they've had in the past. But frankly, I think the most important is to pursue something you think you would like and fits within your desires and your goals in life.
Ron, you want to follow up on that? What do you need to have in place before you say, I'm going to go purchase a franchise?
Well, I think Robert's right. You start with what are you interested in and what do you want to do. I think the next step, frankly, then, is to get a complete understanding of the real economics of the franchise that you're looking at. And I think that what I mean by real economics, when you get that franchise disclosure document, it's going to give you the surface material. It's going to tell you what the initial investment is. It's going to tell you what the royalty rates are. You're going to see those sorts of things. But there's really, I think, at least two other things that you have to do to fully understand the economic impact. And this is, by the way, separate from site selection, because location, location, location is always in play. The two other things are, make sure that you visit with a lot of the franchisees that are given to you, who the other franchisees are in the system. Dig, dig, dig. Do not be satisfied with the franchisees that the franchisor salesperson directs you to. You're going to get directed to the people that are successful, because the franchisor salesperson is interested in selling you a franchise. They're not going to send you to the struggling franchisee. Find out how the struggling franchisees are doing and why. And then the second and bigger piece, or more nefarious, I would say, piece, is understand the tie between what the franchisor is requiring you to buy and how much of that the franchisor controls. And what I mean by this is, in item 8 of your FDD, this is getting hyper-technical, but franchisors require franchisees to buy certain products either from them or from their approved suppliers. If you're required to buy a product from an approved supplier, the franchisor most frequently has made some side deal with the supplier. So the supplier is raising the price and funneling some of what you're paying the supplier back to the franchisor. You have no ability to go out and buy products competitively on the marketplace. And so if you find that you're having to buy a required product at 20%, 30% over market, you're stuck. There's nothing you can do. And so while you might look at a pro forma on the front end and go, well, this looks good, unless you understand what the actual prices are in that system and what that franchisor is requiring you to buy, you're never going to fully understand the unit economics. And without understanding the unit economics, you're making a giant, you're just rolling the dice on whether or not this will work for you.
Carmen, just to follow up a little bit on one of the things he said, let's say you do go visit with a franchisee, not someone that you've been directed to, but in fact someone that you have chosen. What do you ask them?
Well, you want to get them to open up and talk, but sometimes you have to recognize that they've almost got a competing motivation, because they don't want to diminish the value of their business by telling you all the bad things that might be behind the closet that you don't necessarily get to see. So you've really got to work on them and get them to open up as best you can. But I'd go the next step if possible, and some of the most successful franchisees I've seen had the opportunity to work in the business at someone else's franchise before they bought their own. You see that a lot in AAHOA with the families and the multi-generations, or bringing working at one of your relatives or close family friends' hotel. But in any franchising situation, that is a great opportunity to really, work behind the counter or whatever it is, and really get your hands dirty and learn it from the inside out. If a franchisee ever gets that opportunity, you should take it, even if it means you're deferring your business decision by 6 months or so. You can't go wrong.
That seems like it would be a great experience. And as you said, I mean, you see a lot of successful franchisees who've been in that business. Yeah. It lends itself to what Robert said, do something that interests you, something you understand. But I want to talk about the economics of it. It would seem to me that in the last 3 years we've had a significant downturn that has, of course, impacted everybody, including franchisees. It seems that you could have all the experience in the world, you could have the best deal possible, but some franchises just aren't working right now. I know, Robert, you work with an entire list of people in all sorts of industries. Which franchises are working, which franchises are not working?
There's no magic answer to that question in terms of a particular industry working better than another industry. I mean, there's no secret that the hotel industry has been substantially impacted by the fact that the economy has taken a downturn, and there's less disposable income out there. And you have sometimes fast food businesses that, while their sales have gone down, they have not gone down as fast or as much as other businesses where there may be more luxurious type of food items. But the reality is that the economy has had an impact. Many franchisors have been able to deal with it better than others. They've been more proactive. You may be seeing many more value menu items in terms of restaurants. With regard to hotels, you have those frequent stay 3 nights, get the 4th night free. You have all kinds of creative systems that are put in place and programs to attract new customers. The franchisors typically have disclaimers in their franchise agreements that say, look, we do not guarantee any particular level of income success or profitability, but you have to understand that does not necessarily exclude them from liability, if you may, or protect them from liability if they impose on a franchisee requirements that may not be commercially reasonable. For instance, one of the biggest problems that exists today in terms of the relationship between franchisor and franchisee in a down economy is that where the franchisor is trying to implement programs to attract people, they may take a particular hotel brand that's at a particular economic level, price range, and say, you know what, I know that you're going to charge $79 or $99 per night, but I want you to put a $1,200 mattress. And to me, that's the OPM concept, other people's money, where the franchisor and the franchisee have a conflict. The franchisor wants the franchisee to spend more money to attract customers. You're getting a $1,200 bed for $99, but the franchisee's rate of return on that investment makes no sense. So you have to make sure that the business model for that system remains in check so that it's commercially reasonable under the current circumstances.
Ron, you and I had spoken before about this topic. I think if I'm somebody that's attempting to purchase or would like to purchase a franchise, I probably have this notion that the amount of money I pay up front to purchase that franchise, that's how the franchisor is making money. But you warned me, you said where they're really making their money are those products that they require you to buy. And I don't think a lot of people understand how important that is to make sure you have a handle on that before you go into this.
And I have to tell you, I used the word nefarious before. I don't necessarily mean it's deceitful, but I will tell you that it's hard to find, because in the federally required disclosure, all they're required to tell you is we do this, and here's the total amount of money we make doing it across the system. They're not required to tell you how much the markup is on a particular product. They're not required to tell you who the vendors they do it with and the ones they don't. It's a very difficult thing to get your hands around, and frankly, my advice to people on how you go about doing this is you do go out and you find not necessarily a disgruntled franchisee or even a successful franchisee, but you find franchisees who are willing to share with you the things like, the real basics here. What are their costs of goods on a percentage basis, so that you can figure out, well, what's the difference between if I were buying these products out on the open market at this income level versus I'm having to buy it within the system. What's my cost of goods sold? How do I figure it out? And to sort of follow up just a little bit on what Robert was saying and the impact of the last 3 years on the economy, I think one of the things that's happened on the plus side, franchisors have become much more they've extended a lot of accommodations. They know everybody's in hardship. They're maybe more flexible. But there's a lot more people out there right now who are willing to, they've lost their job, all they really have left is their 401k and the equity in their house, and they're desperate to do something. And franchisors are sort of feeding on that. There are people who wouldn't normally think about being their own business owners, people who are maybe in senior management of a hotel or a manager of a restaurant. They think, I would like to do this, but they don't have the capital necessarily to do it. I'm not saying they shouldn't, and I'm not saying they should explore it. But these sort of sophisticated financial issues, they need to understand almost more than anybody because they have such a thin margin for error. They need to understand that both the legal and economic impact of what they're doing down deep. Because if you just take what the franchisor sells you, it's not going to be enough.
Carmen, to follow up on
Sure.
one of the things he talked about, when you're negotiating on the front side, which is where, of course, all the good negotiations happen, are the purchasing requirements, are those a negotiable point for the franchisor? I mean, if that's their major profit center, are they actually willing to negotiate on that?
They're usually not willing to negotiate with an individual franchisee, even someone who's been in the system for a long time, although once you're in the system, you usually have the opportunity to propose an alternative supplier. And you want to make sure that that language is in the contract, that you have the opportunity to bring alternatives to the table to try and get a better price. That gets into an area that I hope we get to about the value of being part of a franchisee association so that as a group the franchisees can step forward and try and get better prices. But I wanted to go back a little bit. You had asked about the recession and the impact. There's two areas that I've seen actually weather the storm pretty well, and maybe it'll help someone out there. Haircuts. Those haircut franchises, Clips, and there's several variations on the name Clips. People still get their haircut even when the economy is bad, and they're doing fine from what I've seen. And another one that surprised me a little bit, some lawn care franchisees have done relatively well, because it seems that even when the people inside the house or the McMansion are having trouble paying the mortgage, they don't want everyone on the block to know that that's the case, so they're going to keep up that lawn until the last possible moment. So those are a couple out there that have done a little bit better than some of the others that Robert was talking about that I think are more cyclical by their nature.
So cutting hair or cutting grass, you're going to be okay. Well, we need to take a quick time out, and we'll be back with more of the AAHOA educational experience on franchising right after this. Hi, I'm Chip Rogers, and welcome back to the AAHOA educational experience. This week we're talking about franchising, and this second segment we'll start with Robert Zarko. I guess one of the simplest things you can do if you were thinking about purchasing a franchise is read the agreement. Read the franchise agreement. How important is that?
You know, Chip, it's funny that you bring up that point because it would sound rather basic and an actual assumption that no one would ever get into a business without signing a without reviewing a franchise agreement before they signed it. The reality is that there's an astounding amount of franchisees out there that are signing these agreements based simply on the representations made by the franchisor, salespeople to the franchisee. And the message out there to the community is you must read your franchise agreement. And if you are not capable of reading it, and even if you believe you're capable of reading it and understanding it, we suggest that you strongly align yourself and find an attorney, especially one that is experienced in the area of franchise law, to explain to you all of the provisions that exist in these contracts and the consequences and ramifications of those provisions. Many times, Chip, there are representations that are made by these aggressive franchise salespeople that are commission-based in terms of their earnings, and they go out of their way to make sure that they seduce or induce franchisees to sign these contracts. And the reality is that when you then read the franchise agreements, there are disclaimers, there are provisions in the contract that specifically contradict the precise representations being made by the salespeople. It's a very, very important element that the franchisee be reviewed in great detail with an emphasis on the miscellaneous provisions, what typically people call the boilerplate. Most franchisees that say, oh, I read the agreement, they focus on what the initial franchise fee is, what the royalty fee is, what the advertising fee is, how big of a territory they have, or do not have, and because of matters like Ron said, that are important, such as supplier obligations and things like that, they may focus on that, and even to a lesser extent, even though they're of critical importance. But the miscellaneous provisions, the choice of law, venue provisions, if there's a dispute, where it's going to take place, whether or not there's a waiver of jury trial, whether or not there's an arbitration provision, all of these elements really guide the relationship, and they must be considered because you never know when, in fact, that relationship may go sour. So do not invest any money in any franchise without reviewing the franchise agreement in detail, without reading the franchise disclosure document, the FDD, and make sure you align yourself with an accountant that can review and prepare a pro forma, in terms of the financial picture that they anticipate, and a franchise attorney that can help you read and understand the contract.
Ron, Robert brought up a really good point. You have franchisor salespeople working off commission, good people, I'm sure, also very skilled at getting you to buy something that maybe you don't fully understand. Franchisor salesperson walks into your office, says, I want to sell you this franchise. You're probably talking about a multi-million-dollar investment. What do you need to look for from that sales pitch, and following up on what he said, what are the things you need to look for to make sure that what he's talking about is also represented in the documents?
Well, you start by reading the document, and to follow up just a bit on what Robert said, in the miscellaneous provisions is going to be the piece of information that's going to make most everything that franchise or sales guy says to you irrelevant. There's going to be a provision in there in 99% of these agreements that say, no matter what else we've said to you, if it's not written down here, it doesn't matter. You can't rely on it. You can't, we didn't mean it. We didn't authorize anybody to say anything. It's called an integration clause, but whatever it's called, you're going to find this provision that basically says, don't believe us, because we couldn't tell you that anyway. And so, and I say 99% because I'm thinking there might be one out there that doesn't have it, but guys, have you ever seen one without one of those integration clauses? They all have it.
Very rarely.
They all have it. And so, it's not that people shouldn't listen to the franchise salesperson, because they're going to be able to explain the system to you, tell you what kind of customers you might get. They're knowledgeable people about the business generally, and you need the information that they're giving you in order to make an informed decision. But that can't be the end of it. You've got to read the contract. You've got to understand the contract. One of the things, Robert talked about making sure you get an accountant and you get a lawyer, and there's nothing more that Robert's ever said that I agree with more, frankly. And one of the main reasons franchisees say to me after they get in trouble, because frankly, most of the people I do business with are people who didn't read their contract in the front end, didn't do any of this negotiation, and now something's gone wrong. And you ask them, why didn't you take care of this in the front? And what a majority of times what they say is, well, the franchisor or sales guy told me they're not going to negotiate the franchise agreement anyway. So I figured I was just going to be throwing away my money to go talk to a franchisor lawyer about negotiating the contract. It might be true that the franchisor is not going to negotiate with you, but you're not going to know until you ask, number one. And at the time that you're a prospect, when you're thinking about buying the franchise, you have more bargaining leverage at that moment than you're ever going to have, because they want your money. And once you've signed the contract, you have signed up to play in their ballpark. With their lawyers have crafted that arrangement. You need to use that bargaining power when you have it. To follow up on that last point here, even if they won't negotiate, if it turns out that you hire a lawyer and they go through and they tell you, you need to get this changed and this changed and this changed, and you go to the franchisor and you say, I need all these changes, and they say, look, we're not changing anything, take it or leave it. Two things are true at that moment. One is, you know what the deal is, and at least you're fully educated, and so it minimizes your risk. And second of all, it should tell you a lot about that franchisor, that if they will not make any changes to accommodate your needs to their standard form contract now, rest assured that down the road, if something goes wrong, they're not going to be particularly accommodating. You need to understand that before you go in, because as you mentioned, Chip, the franchisor salesperson, he's your best friend. When you start negotiating directly with the franchisor and he says, we're not making any changes for you, take it or leave it, they're showing their true colors at that point.
Before we finish up this show, I do want to point out that we're talking a lot about things to look out for, being very wary of what's happening with the franchisor, the agreements that are being put in front of you. Someone may watch this and say, well, you know, I really don't want to buy a franchise, but I want to get into the business. I just want to go independent. Is that a smart move? I mean, I don't want people to take away from this that getting a franchise is a bad move, because there's a lot of really positive things about joining a franchise.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are, and the most obvious is the power of the brand behind the franchise, because that's probably not something that the independent can replicate very easily. And that's really what you're making some trades here. You want to buy into the power of the brand. You want to buy in, and this is something Ron's been talking about, you want to buy into group purchasing power, where you are going to be able to get better prices for the essentials to run the business. And you've got to analyze the contract and the disclosure document to make sure that's really true, and it's not just an illusion that the franchise salesman has presented to you. So when you enter into this thing, I try and advise clients that you're making a choice, you're making some trade-offs. And so on the one hand, you've got the upside. The franchise salesman has explained that to you. You've seen what it could be if everything works out just right. But now, let's go through that franchise agreement, and let's think about everything that could go wrong. For example, here's my brand new shiny retail establishment, but am I vulnerable to competition from my own franchisor with internet sales? Something that we didn't have to worry about, 10, 15 years ago, but it's a huge issue now. Is there going to be a competing retail establishment encroaching on the market after I develop it? And this is sometimes you hear about these hot concepts from the coasts or from Florida that make their way to Chicago in the middle of the country. And this is great. I saw it in Florida. I want to do it here. I'm going to develop that market. Once you develop the market, what's your protection? Are you going to get the benefits of that, or are you just paving the way for someone else? There's a million things that could go wrong. And ultimately, you've got to get that client thinking about each one so they can make an informed choice.
One of the things I'd like to add, Chip, is that the most significant aspect of joining a franchise system is that there is already a proven business method of carrying out that type of business. You already have someone who's invented the mousetrap. They've already tried and tested different angles, different approaches, different programs, different methodologies to sell the program. They fine-tune the program and the system, and that brings substantial value along with the power of the brand, as Carmen said, as to why franchising is a wonderful way of doing business.
Thank you. Well, for Carmen Caruso, Ron Gardner, and Robert Zarco, thanks for joining us this week on the AAHOA Educational Experience. We'll see you again next week.